Madison Thompson stood at the firing line of Fort Benning's qualification range, her brown hair pulled back in a tight regulation bun as she struggled to load a magazine into her M4 carbine. Around her, fellow recruits handled their weapons with growing confidence, while her hands trembled visibly with each attempt to seat the magazine properly. "Thompson, what the hell are you doing?" barked Drill Sergeant Miller as the magazine clattered to the ground for the third time. "My 6-year-old daughter can load an M4 faster than you. How did you even make it past week 1?" The other recruits suppressed their laughter, but their sideways glances said everything. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? Let us know in the comments. And if you believe that heroes come in the most unexpected forms, don't forget to subscribe. Thompson was clearly the weakest link in their platoon, someone who would probably wash out before graduation. What none of them knew was that hidden in Madison's personal effects was a Special Forces support badge that would make every drill sergeant on that range question everything they thought they knew about combat experience, classified operations, and the complex psychology of a warrior trying to start over. The morning had started like every other at Fort Benning's basic combat training, with Alpha Company awakened at 4:30 a.m. for physical training, followed by weapons qualification. Madison had been awake since 3:15 a.m., sitting on her bunk staring at her trembling hands, knowing that today would bring another round of humiliation and failure. At 32, she was significantly older than most recruits, having spent her 20s in a completely different world, the classified realm of Special Forces support operations in combat zones across the Middle East and Africa. The truth about Madison Thompson was buried in classified files that required top-secret clearance to access. For 7 years, she had been Staff Sergeant Madison Thompson, U.S. Army Special Forces support specialist, attached to Operational Detachment Alpha teams in some of the most dangerous regions on Earth. While not a Green Beret herself, the Special Forces teams remained all male during her service. Madison had been part of the cultural support teams that enabled Special Forces to interact with local women in conservative societies where male soldiers could not. Madison's specialty had been signals intelligence and tactical communications in hostile environments. She had set up secure communications networks in remote villages, intercepted enemy transmissions during high-risk operations, and maintained critical battlefield communications when conventional systems failed. Her work had directly contributed to the success of dozens of classified missions, including several high-value target operations that had eliminated terrorist leadership. But Madison's career with Special Forces had ended abruptly during a night operation in Syria. Her team had been ambushed while attempting to extract a high-value intelligence source from ISIS-controlled territory. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong when their position was compromised, leading to a fierce firefight in close quarters. Madison had been forced to engage multiple enemy combatants at point-blank range, the first time she had been required to use lethal force directly rather than supporting from a distance. The physical wounds from that night had healed within months. A bullet grazed to her left shoulder and shrapnel wounds to her right leg. But the psychological trauma was devastating. Madison developed what combat psychologists termed weapons association trauma, a condition where handling firearms triggered immediate panic responses tied to the memories of that night. Her hands would shake uncontrollably, her heart rate would spike, and her mind would flood with flashbacks so vivid she could smell the cordite in blood. After 18 months of unsuccessful therapy and diminished effectiveness in her role, Madison made the difficult decision to leave Special Forces entirely. She requested a transfer to a completely different military path, believing that starting fresh as a regular soldier might help her overcome her psychological barriers. "Thompson, step off the line," Drill Sergeant Miller commanded after her 5th failed attempt to properly seat the magazine. "You're holding up the entire platoon. Figure out your malfunction or I'm recommending you for recycling." Private Jenkins, a 19-year-old former high school athlete with natural aptitude for military training, shook her head as Madison walked past. "How did she even make it this far? My little brother could handle an M4 better than that." "Maybe she's just nervous," suggested Private Chen, one of the few recruits who had shown Madison any kindness. "Some people take longer to get comfortable with weapons." But Madison knew this wasn't about comfort or familiarity. This was about trauma. Every time she touched the M4, her mind instantly transported her back to that night in Syria. The weight of the weapon in her hands, identical to what she had felt when fighting for her life. During the afternoon classroom session on tactical field communications, Madison found herself struggling with another aspect of basic training that should have been second nature. The instructors were teaching rudimentary radio procedures and basic encryption protocols, but their methods seemed elementary compared to the sophisticated communication systems Madison had operated in combat zones. Remember, recruits? Proper radio discipline can mean the difference between mission success and failure, Drill Sergeant Rodriguez explained to the class. Always use your call signs and keep transmissions brief. Madison wanted to point out the oversimplifications in their approach. The failure to discuss frequency hopping to avoid signal interception, the importance of transmission timing to prevent triangulation, or the backup procedures when primary communications were compromised. But she remained silent. Speaking up would only draw attention to knowledge she wasn't supposed to possess. That evening, Madison sat alone in the barracks, cleaning her assigned M4 with mechanical precision. Her hands moved through the disassembly and cleaning process with the muscle memory that came from thousands of hours of weapons maintenance in far more demanding environments than basic training. She could field strip and reassemble the rifle blindfolded, as long as she was cleaning it rather than preparing to fire it. The moment she thought about actually using the weapon, her hands would begin to shake. The breaking point came during week 6 of basic training. Madison was facing her third consecutive failure of the rifle qualification, which would automatically result in her being recycled or potentially discharged. As she stood at the firing line for what might be her final attempt, her hands were shaking so badly that she could barely shoulder the weapon. "Thompson, this is your last chance," Drill Sergeant Miller said quietly, approaching her position. "If you can't qualify today, we'll have to recommend you for additional training before you can continue." Madison nodded, knowing that this moment would determine whether she could continue pursuing her goal of rebuilding her military career. She raised the rifle, trying to control her breathing and steady her hands. Through the sights, she could see the target clearly, but her mind was already racing through memories of that night in Syria, the sound of gunfire, the spray of blood as her bullets found their marks. As she began to squeeze the trigger, her hands started trembling violently. The shot went wide, missing the target completely. Madison lowered the weapon, knowing that her basic training progression was effectively over. She had failed to qualify with the most basic infantry weapon, despite having used it in actual combat. Just as Drill Sergeant Miller was about to call a halt to her qualification attempt, the range's emergency alert system began blaring. This wasn't a drill. The distinctive pattern indicated a security breach somewhere on the base. Within seconds, radio chatter filled the air as security personnel responded to reports of armed individuals who had breached the perimeter near the ammunition supply point. "All recruits return to the barracks immediately," Miller ordered. "This is not a training exercise. Move!" But Madison couldn't move. Through the emergency radio traffic, she was hearing details that triggered every instinct she had developed during years of Special Forces support operations. The intruders were using military-grade communications equipment, moving with tactical precision, and demonstrating knowledge of base security protocols that suggested insider information. This wasn't a random security breach. It was a coordinated attack by professionals with specific objectives. "Drill Sergeant Miller," Madison said, approaching him as he coordinated the recruit evacuation. "The breach at the ammunition supply point. They're using frequency-hopping communications and military movement techniques." Miller looked at her with surprise. "Thompson, how would you know anything about frequency-hopping communications? This isn't the time for speculation." Before Madison could respond, the base security officer approached Miller with an urgent message. "Sergeant, the intruders have taken control of the ammunition supply point. They're using encrypted communications we can't break, and they've established defensive positions that suggest military training. We're trying to establish contact, but they've jammed our standard frequencies." "Drill Sergeant Miller," Madison said quietly, "I need to speak with the security officer immediately. I can help with the communications problem." Miller stared at her incredulously. "Thompson, you can't even qualify with an M4. What makes you think you could help with a complex security situation?" Madison reached into her pocket and retrieved something that made Miller's expression change completely. Her Special Forces support badge, the distinctive insignia showing crossed arrows with a tab above that was instantly recognizable to anyone familiar with special operations. The badge was worn and faded from years of service, clearly authentic and completely incongruous with her status as a struggling recruit. "Staff Sergeant Madison Thompson, 5th Special Forces Group Support Specialist, Communications and Signals Intelligence," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. 7 years operational experience, including 3 in direct combat support roles. Drill sergeant, I know how to counter their communications jamming. The firing range fell silent, except for the continuing emergency alerts. Miller stared at the Special Forces badge, trying to process the revelation that his worst-performing recruit was actually a combat-experienced Special Forces support specialist. "Why didn't you tell us about this background?" Miller asked. "Because I wanted to start over as a regular soldier, not as a former Special Forces support element," Madison replied. "But right now, there are people on this base who are in danger from attackers with military training and equipment." Miller grabbed his radio and contacted base security, explaining the situation. Within minutes, Madison found herself in the base tactical operations center, facing Colonel Richards and the senior staff who were coordinating the emergency response. "Thompson," Colonel Richards said, studying her hastily retrieved personnel file, "your Special Forces record is impressive, but according to your basic training reports, you can't even qualify with an M4. How do you explain that discrepancy?" Madison took a deep breath. "Sir, I developed weapons association trauma after a mission in Syria went bad. It affects my ability to handle weapons in training environments, but my technical knowledge and communications expertise remain intact." Richard studied her carefully. "Thompson, are you confident you can help us counter their communications jamming?" "Sir, give me access to your communications equipment and I can break through their jamming. I recognize the pattern. It's similar to what insurgent groups were using in northern Syria in 2019. What happened next would become legend at Fort Benning. Madison Thompson, the recruit who couldn't qualify with an M4, took control of the base communications center with the confidence and authority of someone who had managed battlefield communications under far more challenging conditions. Her fingers flew across the equipment, configuring frequency patterns and encryption protocols that countered the attackers' jamming efforts. "They're using a rolling frequency pattern with 5-second intervals," Madison explained to the communications team. "If we synchronize our transmissions to match their pattern but offset by 2.5 seconds, we can establish communication in the gaps between their jamming pulses." Within minutes, Madison had established communication with security forces surrounding the ammunition supply point. Using her knowledge of tactical operations, she helped coordinate a response that neutralized the attackers without casualties to base personnel. Her ability to predict the attackers' movements based on their communications patterns proved invaluable, allowing security forces to anticipate and counter each action. The entire operation lasted 43 minutes from start to finish. When it was over, 6 armed intruders were in custody, the ammunition supply point was secure, and the base had returned to normal operations without a single shot being fired. "Thompson," Drill Sergeant Miller said, approaching her with visible respect, "I owe you an apology. We all do. Your performance issues with weapons don't reflect your true capabilities or your service." Madison looked around at the faces that had shown her nothing but disappointment for 6 weeks. "Drill Sergeant, I still can't qualify with an M4. That problem hasn't been solved. But you just coordinated a complex security response that saved lives and secured critical military assets," Colonel Richards pointed out. "Perhaps we need to reconsider how we evaluate soldiers with specialized backgrounds and psychological challenges." 2 days later, Madison was called to Colonel Richards' office. She expected to be informed of her recycling or discharge due to her continued inability to qualify with weapons. Instead, she found herself facing an entirely different conversation. "Thompson, I've reviewed your full service record, including the classified portions," Richards began. "Your experience with Special Forces and your actions during the security breach demonstrate exceptional value to the Army. However, your weapons association trauma presents a significant challenge for conventional service." "I've spoken with the commander of the Military Intelligence School at Fort Huachuca," Richards continued. "They're interested in your signals intelligence background and your experience with encrypted communications. There's a position available as a communications intelligence instructor that wouldn't require weapons qualification." Madison completed basic training 2 weeks later, receiving a medical waiver for the weapons qualification portion, based on her documented trauma and prior combat experience. She was assigned to Fort Huachuca as a communications intelligence instructor, where her expertise could be properly utilized without triggering her trauma. The recruit who couldn't zero her M4 had proven that sometimes the greatest strengths emerge from the deepest struggles, and that true expertise isn't about perfect performance in every context, but about finding the right way to continue serving despite invisible wounds. As Madison prepared to leave Fort Benning for her new assignment, Drill Sergeant Miller approached her one last time. "Thompson, I've been a drill sergeant for 12 years, and I've never been so wrong about a recruit. You've taught me something important about not judging soldiers by a single metric." Madison smiled, the first genuine smile since arriving at basic training. "We all have our battles, Drill Sergeant. Some are just more visible than others.